Friends, welcome to the Miami Jewish Festival, the film festival, I should say, the world's largest festival of its kind. And we want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all these years. My name is Gary P. Zola, and I am the professor of the American Jewish Experience at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I also have the privilege of directing the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives. We consider this institution the largest catalog collection of documentary evidence on the history of Jewish life in America. And I'm very, very pleased and honored to be moderating this virtual conversation with the director of a wonderful new documentary, which will be seen during this festival, and that is director Steven Pressman. The movies from the movie Levys of Monticello, which is premiering here at the Miami Film Festival this year. So thank you all for joining us in this virtual conversation. Well, Mr. Pressman, I want to begin by saying that, this is not a paid political announcement. I really and truly enjoyed this documentary, and I want to encourage all of those who are listening to view this wonderful documentary, fascinating documentary, and to spread the word with friends about the good work you've done. So before we get into some of the content, let me begin by just first of all explaining to people the basic story of this documentary, because there will probably be some people who don't know a thing about this. Most people know about Thomas Jefferson's very famous home, Monticello. We learn about it in school, and we hear about the role that Jefferson played in actually creating the home. And many people probably over the course of their lifetime have visited the home. But a little known fact, which has become, in a sense, the main theme of your documentary, is the whole story of a very important, significant Jewish family, the Levys, who end up preserving this house for America. And in fact, as you point out, and as scholars have pointed out, actually own the house and care for the house longer than the Jeffersons. And many people don't know anything about this story. And it's a fascinating story that not only is a simple story about, oh, well, people purchased this house and they kept it and they took care of it and then gave it, to the American people. It's a lot more of an intricate story with some very fascinating curves and twists to it. So tell us how, before we sort of get into that content, tell us how you came to the story and why it was, as a film documentarian, why you wished to devote yourself to it.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. And first of all, it's just a real pleasure for me personally, to be back with the wonderful folks at the Miami Jewish Film Festival. This is I'm very pleased and proud to say this is my third film at the festival, and it's a fabulous festival. And I just want to thank everybody for making that possible. As you mentioned, this is a remarkable story, the story of the Levy family and their relationship to Monticello. It's a little bit of a small world story, how I came to make this film. Somewhat coincidentally, many years ago, I was a journalist in Washington, D.C., and one of my colleagues at Congressional Quarterly magazine, where I worked in Washington, D.C., was a guy named Mark Leibson. Mark Leibson, years after I knew him as a reporter, and this now goes back about 20 or so years ago, Mark happened to write a book called Saving Monticello. Actually, there were two books written 20 some odd years ago, one by Mark, another fabulous book by Professor Mel Urofsky, also about the Levy family in Monticello. So all these years later, I had made two previous documentaries, both of which happened to be Holocaust related. And a few years back, when I was thinking about what my next film would be, I was looking for another just great American Jewish story to tell. And I happened to be doing a little bit of daydreaming at my little home office in San Francisco, where I live. And there on the shelf was Mark's book, Saving Monticello, which I had bought some years earlier. And I have to confess, and I hope Mark isn't listening, I hadn't really read his book cover to cover. I only knew vaguely what it was about. But I took it off the shelf that day and started thumbing through it. And that's when that sort of light bulb went off in my head, thinking, gee, I wonder if anybody's ever done anything in terms of a documentary film. Much to my delight, that had not happened. And I suddenly knew that I had this great story to tell about the Levy family and Monticello. And so, with all due respect to Mark and to Mel Urofsky, even though they had written these wonderful books, all these years later, as I discovered, it's still a pretty relatively unfamiliar story to a lot of people. And so it was a real pleasure and a real privilege to be able to tell the story in a documentary film, this remarkable story of the Levy family, and as you pointed out, their ownership for longer than Thomas Jefferson and his family of this wonderful treasure that we have called Monticello.
Well, that's a great, and we're lucky you did that. So let's get into some of the content of the film. For the friends listening in, what many people, as we pointed out, many people already know and are very familiar with the idea that this was Thomas Jefferson, our third president. It was his home, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and he was a sort of a Renaissance man who was interested in all sorts of subjects, and he was an architect, and this was his dream home and so forth. Many people, why would they, have no idea what happened after, towards the end of his life. And to bring us to how the Levys become connected, in a nutshell, Jefferson has some financial difficulties towards the end of his career, and as he's aging, and ultimately the home after his death it's impossible for his heirs to sustain it, and so they sell it, and they sell it to a family that holds on to it for a brief time, and within that rather brief time, it falls into disrepair, terrible disrepair. In fact, if I recall correctly, and you can help me out here, it's almost on the verge of being torn down. That's how shambulated it was. And this is where this interesting Jewish figure, very remarkable man by the name of Uriah P. Levy, who comes in for his own reasons, which I'm going to let you talk about, and purchases Monticello. And this man's career is fascinating. The first sort of important scholarly work done on Levy, Uriah P. Levy, is a 1949 journal article by a fine scholar named Abram Canoff, who writes, and this title has always stuck with me. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Steve, but he calls the article "The Story of a pugnacious Commodore. And that really, when you learn about Uriah P. Levy, that's a perfect title for him. So why don't you take it from there
Sure.
and tell us what brought this? Who was this fellow Levy, and why on earth did he buy Monticello?
Sure, absolutely. Well, you're absolutely right about Uriah P. Levy being pugnacious. Um, so let's back up a little bit. You mentioned that Thomas Jefferson had some financial troubles toward the end of his life. In fact, he died heavily, heavily in debt. He owed in $1820. He dies in 1826. Over $100,000, which would be millions in our currency today. Thomas Jefferson loved the finer things in life. He was a profligate spender on things like books and wine, and he never stopped tinkering with his beloved Monticello. And unfortunately, he left his family saddled with these immense debts. And so, as you mentioned, the family, within a few years of Jefferson's death in 1826, was forced to sell Monticello to help settle the family's debts. It was owned, as you mentioned, just for a few years by another gentleman, James Turner Barclay, who had some strange ideas. He wasn't interested at all in the house. He wanted Thomas Jefferson's agricultural lands. He had this cockamamie idea to start a silkworm business up there at Monticello. And within a few years, he just wanted to get rid of the place himself. And you're right that the place was rapidly falling into decay. As a matter of fact, Monticello was already falling into some level of ruin, even during Thomas Jefferson's final years. He no longer had the funds to keep up the place. So the place was really in danger of falling down, even at the time of Jefferson's death. Needless to say, our hero, Uriah Phillips Levy, enters the scene and buys the house in 1834 for the princely sum of $2,500. And above all else, Uriah Levy buys Monticello because he is a lifelong admirer of Thomas Jefferson, largely because of Jefferson's advocacy and strong beliefs in religious liberty and religious tolerance. Thomas Jefferson, who is the champion of religious liberty, both during his colonial days as in Virginia, as well as during the early years of the United States. Thomas Jefferson is the champion of religious liberty and religious freedom. And Uriah Levy, believe it or not, comes from a long-standing Jewish family, a family that can trace its roots in our country to before the United States was the United States. His ancestors originally, one branch of the family is a Sephardic family that is escaping the Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisition way back in the early 1720s and 1730s, a branch of the family that lands in Savannah. Uriah Levy himself is born in Philadelphia in 1792. And by the time he's born, Uriah himself is already, and this is stunning for a lot of Jewish audiences to hear, Uriah Levy is already a fifth generation American. So that tells you how far back this family goes. They're not, I should say, they're not a deeply religious family, but they are very, very proud to be Jews. They are, some of Uriah's relatives are very active in the revolutionary movement in Philadelphia, where Uriah is born in 1792. So this is a Jewish family that has long-standing, deep patriotic ties to this young country. And Uriah grows up fiercely devoted to the principles of Thomas Jefferson. Uriah himself joins the Navy at a young age, really as a young boy. He becomes a cabin boy at the age of 10, and he winds up having a 50-year career in the young American Navy, rising to become the first Jewish Commodore. And as I mentioned, along the way, because of his deep devotion to Thomas Jefferson, winds up as the very unlikely owner of Monticello.
Yeah, and a couple of other things just to add quickly to your fine summary. Levy himself made a number of contributions to the development of Navy protocol. Throughout his career, he actually becomes very much opposed to beating sailors as a way of disciplining them, and it plays an influential role in trying to persuade the military not to use corporal punishment. And the other interesting story we can't get into is how many times during his career in the Navy he fights, gets into fights. This is where pugnacious comes in, because he's attacked for being a Jew, and he undergoes, I think, something like 7 court-martials, some of which apparently, according to scholars, he deserved. But a big defender of his people, and he keeps returning to the Navy, and his career goes on actually to the beginning of the Civil War. He dies during the Civil War.
You're absolutely right. Throughout his entire naval career, which again goes for 50 years, starting in the War of 1812, where as a 20-year-old sailor, Uriah Levy is actually a bit of a hero in a naval battle that takes place during the War of 1812, and that career of his lasts until the opening years of the Civil War. Throughout his entire naval career, Uriah Levy was really constantly the subject of anti-Semitism, both overt and sort of behind his back. We're talking about a time, not surprisingly, where it was not common at all for Jews to be serving in the American military, and particularly the Navy. So Uriah Levy, who is this very proud and defiant Jewish officer, is constantly being subjected to what we would, of course, today call harassment, anti-Semitism, and he fights back, which is one of the reasons why he sometimes gets into some trouble. You mentioned his courts-martial. Yes, he was court-martialed 6 times. He was reinstated on 2 occasions by 2 different American presidents who found no causes at all for the court-martials that Uriah Levy was subjected to. So we're dealing with a guy who is a proud Jew, a stubborn Jew, a very defiant man, willing to stand up for what he believes in. He winds up fighting a duel at one point because he was insulted for being a Jew. We're talking about somebody who stands up fiercely for himself, for his family, and for his religious faith.
So, by the way, just a little American Jewish history comment. This affection for Thomas Jefferson, which you mentioned with regard to Levy, is not unique in the American Jewish experience. For the very reason you point out, Jefferson is given a great deal of credit by those in the know in those years, especially as he got older, Jefferson, for his fierce devotion to religious liberty, and the American Jew appreciated that. And there are many examples of Jews who adulated Jefferson. Now, this brings us to an interesting topic, and that is that much has been said about Jefferson's conflicting values, right? He writes this magisterial document, all men created equal, and so forth. And yet we all know, and we've been exposed to this in the last few decades, about his, perpetuating slavery, his having a family with one of his slaves, at least one, and this whole story where he becomes part of this complicated history, which is so aligned with America's complicated history. This great idea of America, which is often we fall short as a nation, terribly short. Well, the same thing is true of Uriah Levy, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about
Sure.
that, because although there's so much to say about him that's praiseworthy, like Jefferson, like Washington, like even Abraham Lincoln. They're always pimples on the complexion. So
Absolutely.
yeah, please.
Absolutely. You know, I realized very early on as I was working on this film that that telling any sort of story about Monticello is part of that story is inextricably linked to the story of slavery. You mentioned, of course, how closely identified with slavery Thomas Jefferson is. The contradiction of the man who writes the Declaration of Independence over the course of Jefferson's lifetime owns 607 human beings. At any given time during Jefferson's years at Monticello, there are anywhere between 130 and 140 enslaved people, as one of the folks in the film says, toiling for Jefferson's happiness. Well, just as slavery was part of the landscape at Monticello during Jefferson's years, unfortunately, that remained the case during the years that Uriah Levy owned Monticello. Now, I want to hasten to add a couple of things. One is that Monticello really ceased to be a kind of working plantation the way it was during Jefferson's years. But nonetheless, Uriah Levy, when he buys Monticello, also buys a few hundred acres of land. So there is some agricultural activity going on, not a lot. Uriah Levy himself also does not ever live full-time at Monticello. He was at sea. He primarily lived in New York when he wasn't at sea in the Navy, but he did spend some time at Monticello. And at any given time, there were probably at least 20 or 30 enslaved people owned by Uriah Levy during the years that he owned it, leading up to the Civil War. And so I realized as a filmmaker, telling a story about Monticello, unfortunately, telling that story included the troubling and the problematic aspect of a Jewish owner owning slaves. And I have to add just very, very briefly, when I first started working on the film, a couple of friends of mine here in San Francisco were insistent that I find out if the Levys ever had a Seder at Monticello, which I think my friends sort of assumed a Jewish family must have had at some point a Seder at Monticello. And of course, had that occurred, the unmistakable, really perverse irony of celebrating the commemoration of the passage of slavery to freedom back in Egypt, while the owner of this beloved home, Monticello, has slaves on the property. Well, a bit of a spoiler alert, there's no historical evidence at all that the Levys ever celebrated Passover at Monticello. But whether or not they did, that disturbing contradiction remains, that until enslaved people were freed during the Civil War, there continued to be slaves at Monticello, just as there were during Jefferson's days. And it's an unfortunate part of this particular Jewish American story that still endures to this day.
Yes, you make a very good point, and this is, of course, a part of our American Jewish experience. That is, the not insignificant Jews in the American South who were slave owners, and the whole story of African American slavery and Jews who were part of that story. To the best of my knowledge, there is still one synagogue standing that was actually built by slaves, and that is Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim in Charleston, and they have initiated a program of a recognition of this, and I think you also contribute to that by by acknowledging it in your film and being forthright, because there are, of course, people who first of all, don't want to believe it.
Sure.
It's so painful. And others who sadly would like to mute the story and pretend it doesn't exist. And that's also impossible to do, because that's no longer history. That becomes mythology. So we have, we've had so much fun. We're running a little bit out of time. So I want to push us forward to one or two more points before we conclude. And that is the story of what comes after Uriah P. Levy, which is the person who really owns that home for a considerable period of time, and that's Jefferson Levy. And maybe you'll say a word about him, and maybe at this time, and not only talk about Jefferson, but the campaign that begins against Jefferson by a woman named Maud Littleton,
Sure.
who cannot tolerate the idea that a Jew actually owns this American iconic home.
Sure. Jefferson Monroe Levy is Uriah's nephew. Uriah dies in 1862 during the Civil War. For the next several years, there's actually a bit of a legal fight going on for all kinds of reasons, some within the Levy family itself. Needless to say, Monticello is almost threatened with falling into ruin yet again, because ownership doesn't fall back to Uriah's nephew, Jefferson Monroe Levy, until the late 1870s, until about 1879, when Jefferson Monroe Levy, like his uncle, a strong admirer of Thomas Jefferson, he's named for Thomas Jefferson. He's named for two presidents, Jefferson and James Monroe. Jefferson Monroe Levy is the second hero of this story, because he comes in again, and like his uncle, devotes a small part of his own resources to the ongoing preservation and operation of Monticello. Jefferson Monroe Levy winds up owning Monticello even longer than his uncle, from the late 1870s until the 1920s. And in the early years of the 20th century, Jefferson Monroe Levy, by the way, who was serving a couple of terms as a congressman from New York, is subjected to a really quite anti-Semitic, a veiled anti-Semitic campaign to take Monticello away from him, led by, as you mentioned, a woman named Maud Littleton, who gets it into her head that it's time for either the government or some private group to take over Monticello, to preserve it as a shrine to Jefferson, which is all well and good, but unfortunately, Mrs. Littleton really is quite anti-Semitic, and she really just does not like the idea that Monticello is owned by a Jew, and she mounts this campaign that goes on for a few years to basically use the government as a way to take Monticello away from Jefferson Monroe Levy. She does not succeed, but once again, as I discovered in telling this story, what I realized is that telling the story of the Jewish ownership of Monticello provided me an opportunity to really tell that broader story of anti-Semitism as it runs throughout the course of American history. And so whether it's Uriah Levy being subjected to anti-Semitism while he's in the Navy, or his nephew, Jefferson Monroe Levy, being the subject of this effort to take Monticello away from him, when you scrape away a lot of the arguments, unfortunately, it comes down to this persistent and chronic presence of anti-Semitism that, of course, we continue to be confronted with today. So even though the Levy family themselves winds up turning Monticello over to the nonprofit foundation, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, that still runs it to this day, we all know that anti-Semitism is still something that we continue to confront as a society. And I'm hopeful that as people learn the story of the Levys and their remarkable ownership and preservation of Monticello. None of us will forget the kinds of obstacles that they faced and that we continue to face in this country, given the ongoing presence of anti-Semitism.
Well, I said to you before we started recording that I think is one of the master strokes of this film, and I hope everyone will pay attention to it because it's handled so important in such an important way. The bringing this story into relevance of what exactly is currently going on in America. The point which is being made by you and many of the talking scholars is that this is part of the cycle of America, and we are back in that cycle. And this story is repeating that again, and is worth seeing. Well, we're almost out of time, and so I just want to say one or two quick words. First of all, for those of you who think all we've been doing is talking about Jewish men, I want to point out that there's an important part that a Jewish woman plays here, because Uriah, his mother, is buried right there on Monticello, who she herself is a remarkable person. There's a very excellent article on Uriah's mother, and that's an interesting story. And finally, I mentioned to you that right now, part of the redemption of this story is that there's this magnificent chapel for Jewish midshipmen at Annapolis, named after Uriah P. Levy, which is part of his rehabilitation. Meaning by that I mean that I've always felt that if he would able to come back from life and see that chapel named after him, to use a good Latin word, he would plotz, because based on what you've already pointed out, how he struggled with anti-Semitism, to see this magnificent, beautiful facility on Annapolis would be really something I think would find hard to believe. But to end with, by conclusion, let's talk quickly about how it came to be that the story of the Levy family is now part again of the tours and of the story, because what happened was that, and this is partly an anti-Semitic story and partly other things, after it switches over to the foundation, for a long time, the Levys disappear. So maybe to just wrap up, you can tell us about that.
You're absolutely right. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation really wanted to ignore the fact that this Jewish family had saved Monticello, and they were really erased from the history of Monticello. That was finally corrected not until the 1980s, when a then new director came in, who's in my film. He's now retired. Dan Jordan came in and immediately realized that the Levys were an essential part of the story of Monticello. So there was this nice effort to restore and refurbish the gravesite that you mentioned of Uriah's mother. There is now a formal recognition of the Levy legacy, with the explanation of their contribution, their historic and invaluable contribution to owning and preserving Monticello. And it's not that the Levys are a hugely prominent part of the tours that people now have, but the point is that there is recognition, and the folks who run Monticello and the folks who lead and guide visitors now there at Monticello are well versed in the story of the Levys, and rightly so. After all these years, the Levys have been restored really to their rightful place in the history of Monticello, and that's been a very refreshing development after all these years of having really been quite literally banished from the property. Now really they are recognized for having played that significant role in ensuring that this beautiful place that we see today, the place that Thomas Jefferson designed and envisioned, remains as vibrant a place and as an architectural masterpiece that it always has been, in large part because of the contributions of the Levy family.
Yeah, and so many great American Jewish historians fought for so long to rectify that. My own teacher, Dr. Malcolm Stern, Rabbi Stern, and also, of course, Saul Wiener, who was devoted to this. They deserve a lot of credit. This has been fascinating. The story, as you point out, is emblematic of Jewish life in America, in my opinion, because Dr. Marcus, my teacher, the namesake of the AJA, used to say the American Jew has made a significant contribution to the American nation. And this is just a case study in that story. So I want to conclude by thanking you, Steven Pressman. Thank you so much for this wonderful contribution you've made to our learning and to the life of the mind. And from this movie, The Levys of Monticello. Thank you so much for joining us. And once again, thanks to all of our members, our sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all of you film lovers for participating in the Miami Jewish Film Festival. And thanks so much. I've enjoyed this conversation immensely.